Welcome, everyone, to Cor Ecclesiae. This platform or program is designed very specifically to provide an opportunity for informed commentary by various panelists and their guests. The primary reason is to make sense of Catholicism in our time, its relationship to other religions, its geopolitical reality, very importantly, the new Leonine pontificate. All these things come to play. And it's important for us to understand what they mean and what the implications or ramifications are for the church and indeed for the world. So the regular panelists are Michelle Loris and Charlie Gillespie and Dan Rober. All of them are members of the Department of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm an emeritus professor there. And all are authors. Two of them are associate deans. And it's an exciting time, not only for the university and indeed for the country, and I put exciting in quotation marks, it's also a time to look reflectively on the challenges facing the Catholic Church. And that's very specifically what Cor Ecclesiae, which comes from the heart of Sacred Heart University, is about. We have a guest today, and the guest is Christopher White. Christopher is the past Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter in Kansas City. He's now in New York. He works in Washington, Georgetown University. But most importantly, and the reason why we have him here today, although he's not unknown to us, he writes for Go Rebuild, and he's been on our program before after the Synod last year. But today, we're going to be talking about his new book. And the new book is, and I've got a copy of it right here in case you're interested, and I'm sure you are, Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy. Well, Chris, let's start off right away, and let me ask this rather simple question, but nonetheless, I'm sure you'll do a wonderful choreography around it, and that is this. Every journalist provides the first draft of history, right? And in many ways, this is a first draft. But first drafts are extremely important. Tell us something about the genesis of this book.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mike. It's good to be with old friends, and especially with Sacred Heart, which is just such a wonderful institution, and to talk about this very exciting time, both in this country, but in the church. To have an American Pope in this moment is quite heady, and we can get all into the weeds of that in the course of this conversation. But the genesis of this book, in all candor, is that I had agreed to do a book on the new Pope whenever it happened and whomever it was. And in full disclosure, the contract was that from the minute he appeared on the balcony, whatever date that was, I had 10 days to produce a manuscript. And so I turned this in on May 18th, which was 10 days after May 8th, the night that Leo appeared on the balcony as our new Pope. The readers of the book will quickly realize that the first third of the book is about the Francis legacy. And of course, I think that Conclave was, in many respects, a referendum on the Francis papacy, and particularly aspects of that, and synodality in particular, which we can talk about. And so I knew that I would sort of frame the book whenever it happened around sort of the sort of great project of Francis, particularly through synodality. And so I had, taken a first stab at that back in the fall, and then I revisited it when Francis went into hospital in February, and then I refined it once more once he passed in April. But that was sort of the early stages of the book.
Yeah. And were you prepared for that? I mean, you've been covering the Vatican for so many years. So, but it's not just simply reportage, it's also analysis. I mean, you nicely thread these various themes through that opening section of the book, which prepares the foundation for the election of Robert Prevost.
Yeah, I think, as any Vatican reporter will do, we all had files on our sort of papabile, potential popes. So I had about 12 files where, one of the main things I had been doing in the lead up to the conclave was, just trying to gather any interview or speech of any leading contender, so that when the time came, I would be prepared. And I also had written profiles of the papabile in the run up to the conclave. And that was, in a sense, the dress rehearsal for the book itself. And quite frankly, writing a book on Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo, was much easier than writing a book on, had it been uh, Cardinal Aveline from Marseille, because I knew Robert Prevost to a certain degree, so I could personalize it a bit in a way that it would have been more difficult had it been someone that I didn't know as well.
Yes, and you can see that personal tone in the book, and that's quite appealing in terms of how you craft the work. What was your sense of him when you met him prior to his election as pontiff? Did you have an intuition that this man was on the rise, or did the election take you by surprise?
I certainly would not have guessed in July of 2023 when I first sat down with him that he would be the next pope. I thought he was a very smart, well-studied individual. I reached out to him right after he arrived in Rome. Pope Francis brought him to head the dicastery for bishops, the very powerful office that does a lot of the vetting for many bishops' appointments around the world. And I knew before that Pope Francis and Prevost had developed a fairly intimate relationship, that they would, have lunch together when he was in town from Peru. And that when I first learned that some years back, I thought, oh, this is someone that the Pope sees as a real confidant. And so it made sense to me that he named him the head of the dicastery for bishops. And I had asked him for an interview as the new American in town, and I'm, from an American paper. But he said, look, interviews, particularly in this role, which is highly sensitive, it's not really something I'm comfortable doing, but I'm happy to get to know you. And we had a very frank, about an hour long conversation. I went home afterwards and wrote down all my notes, some of which I drew from in writing the book. But one of the main things that I was struck by in that conversation was I went in as the reporter used to sort of interrogating my, subject, and how quickly I was struck by how quickly he turned the conversation on me. And there were certain things he wanted to discuss. And it primarily, it was the perspective of someone who came from the United States but really only understood the US church in broad brushstrokes, having lived so much of his adult life outside of it. And having been a reporter that covered the Vatican from the US perspective, but also having previously covered the US church, he had questions for me. And I realized then this is a man who does his homework, who walks into every room prepared and wanting, in a sense, to get something out of it. And I don't mean that it was purely transactional, but he clearly had his own agenda as well. And I respected that.
One final question before we get to the panelists, and that's this: you've written the first work. It's out. It's enjoying appropriate acclaim and response, and now we have a new one out in Spanish, and already it's getting a fair bit of coverage. Was there anything that you saw in those interviews, or what has been reported so far, that would make you change your profile a slight bit, or are you satisfied that you caught the essential Prevost?
Yeah, I think Elise Ann Allen's book, which is now out in Spanish, soon to be out in a few other languages in the course of 2026, really benefits from the fact that she was able to go to Peru and spend a few weeks sort of spending time with those who knew him as a pastor there in Peru, and then of course she had two sit down interviews with him, in which he was able to sort of speak on his own terms. I think, quite frankly, I think the interview and the book, although I have not read the book, but the interview at least, backs up the general sort of portrait that I paint of the man, who was largely in continuity with Francis, but far more cautious as a leader. We see this in the interview. I mean, he almost goes to great pains not to make headlines. The former reporter in me was just saying, "Come on, give us something, spicier. Throw on the Tabasco sauce." But I think this is someone who recognizes in this moment that he wants to be perceived as a bridge builder, and he's trying to calm the waters, and he's doing that really almost from every angle.
Okay, I'm going to throw on some
Do it.
now by bringing Dan Rober in. Dan is, of course, your neighbor now in New York. Dan, what your reaction to Chris's new book?
Chris's book really, again, as you said, Michael, does a great job of giving us a sense of Robert Prevost as um, somebody who, again, emerges out of the American church from his youth, but does not emerge out of the American church of the recent past, of recent decades. I think that's really important, especially in this moment, right? That he is somebody who is looking at the developments in the church in the U.S. with much fresher eyes than a bishop who has been kind of in the midst of it for all this time. So I think again the personal conversations you report there, insofar as you do, kind of back that up, right? If here is somebody who clearly appears to have a critical, balanced perspective on what's going on in the church in the U.S. And I would add to that just a point about the recent interviews that came out, that certainly there was nothing in those interviews that made headlines in the secular media. But as somebody who follows Catholic far-right media, there was a piece in Crisis Magazine a couple of days ago saying basically that Pope Leo, by saying we're not changing anything yet, in fact, is granting a wide berth to development of doctrine in a way that this person was extremely alarmed by, in the way that Leo talked about the need for pastoral care and recognition on a practical level before any kind of doctrinal matters shift, is again very subtle, but it's indicating that, you know, it's indicating something that really, I think, is in continuity with Francis on this very specific point.
Thank you. Charlie, you want to step in now?
Sure. I'm so grateful to have Christopher White with us, building on some of Dan's really sage observations about what it means to be thinking about our Pope Leo coming out of an American context. It's a little different from our polarization. I also want to think a little bit about flavors with you, Christopher White, because there's both Tabasco that gets us intrigued and excited, but there's also your book on the Augustinian Pope, published by a Jesuit ministry. So I want us to think a little bit together about what are some of our opportunities to see the diversity within the Catholic Church. That sure, Robert Prevost as Pope Leo is continuing that Francis legacy, coming from being bishop in Peru, coming from that context of the global church, but also inviting us to think about that caution as perhaps emphasizing turning the temperature down. Are there flavors beyond spicy that we might need to be challenged to want to embrace as a church? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because there's got to be something about coming out with a book that's emphasizing the waning of the Jesuit Pope as we think about all these terms we throw about Pope Leo. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where's our opportunity here to see that big tent is actually not just polarized with two options, but almost Pope Francis's sense of a polyhedron. Lots of different ways to think about what it means to be Catholic. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Before we get to Michelle's commentary, maybe this would be a good chance, Chris, to respond to Charlie's questions. Okay.
I want to say something that I think probably responds to both Dan and Charlie. You know, Dan rightly emphasized how Leo is of the U.S. born, but he doesn't really have the baggage of the U.S. Church. He was never a member of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, for example. And I don't think this is in the book, but one of the things that a member of the conclave said to me in the days after the election was, he was just elected pope, but he probably couldn't be elected as a chair of a USCCB committee. And it just goes to show you how he doesn't have that baggage. And that brings me to Charlie's wise observation that he's taking aspects certainly of Ignatian spirituality and sort of Francis being in the Jesuit mold. But if you look at Francis also drew heavily from the Franciscan tradition. And so this sort of polyhedron sort of image is very apt here. I think what was interesting to me was spending time with so many of the Augustinians in Rome in the days after the election. They were, of course, in great shock and trying to absorb what this meant for them. But one of the lines that they said to me was, thinking back on his time as, head of the Augustinians, they think that he's going to be someone who greatly pleases conservatives most of the time and occasionally disappoints them, and greatly pleases liberals most of the time and occasionally disappoints them. And I think that speaks to the sort of balance that we do find in the Augustinians. But one of the more interesting things I think is when it comes to governance. And I think if you look at the governance model of the Augustinians and the way they make and take decisions, I think we're seeing early signs that Leo wants to see that reflected in his own papacy and to be much more collegial, particularly with the College of Cardinals. And I'm sure we'll get into that later in this conversation. But Anna Rollins, who I quote in the book, has this great line about how if Francis wanted a more synodal church, Leo wants a more synodal papacy. And I think that's right on the money.
Michelle.
So, Chris, first of all, thanks so much for being here. I loved your book. I just was amazed that, not just that you're the first one out of the gate, but, you have 10 minutes to produce it. I also want to just say that I love that you had that intuition that you knew Prevost was going to be the Pope. And there's that little exchange with Barron when Barron says, no, it can never be an American Pope. And you go, well, I think it's Prevost. So those are things that I just wanted to mention to you. But you mentioned synodality. You mentioned, Pope Leo's cautiousness. Clearly, he wants to continue Francis's, important work in synodality. And according to our poll, which I know we'll be talking about 65% of Roman Catholics agree that he should continue that work. Only 48% report knowing so much about it, interestingly enough. But nonetheless, I guess my question is, because this is such an important work, and I think there are two things I was thinking about. One that you mentioned, that he only has a broad brush of American. He's not, although he said in the interview, well, I'm an American and people will, the bishops can't say I don't understand the issues. I'm wondering, so what do you think it's going to take for him to really make synodality take root? And how do you think, a little bit more, if you could say a little bit more about how you think he's going to do that similarly to Francis, differently from Francis?
Chris?
I think the most encouraging thing we saw from Leo was that the meeting he had a few weeks after his election with the Synod Secretariat. Of course, this isn't in the book because of deadlines. But that meeting took place, I believe it was 3 weeks after his election. And he didn't have them come to him. He went to the Synod office. And he stayed for about 2.5, 3 hours, and talking to some of the members that were at that meeting, overwhelming consensus was his deep investment in the process, his sense that these 10 study groups that have been tasked with looking at some of the neuralgic, hot button sensitive issues, however you want to frame them, some of the complicated questions. He really gave his blessings for them to keep on doing their work. And the most interesting thing that I can say that I've heard in recent weeks is just that these reports that they're producing are messy, are complicated, but deeply engaged in the work of synodality, and they feel the backing of the Pope to say what is necessary. And so it's going to be interesting to see. I'm looking to see, one, what those reports say, if they publish them and make them available. I think publishing those reports will be a great sort of sign of synodality, of transparency, of openness. So I think it's necessary for them to make public what these study groups have done and produced. And then I want to see how he moves on the study groups. That's what I'm looking. Those are the early sort of tea leaves that I'm looking for at this point. I think for Leo, I mean, one of the things that Archbishop Tim Costello from Perth said, and this was about a year before the synod began. So I think it was maybe early 2023, could have even been late 2022, um, before the synod arrived in Rome. He said, at the heart of this is what needs to be decided up top, and what can we allow to be decided at the local level. And that I think there's room for tremendous, tremendous flexibility. And, I think that's where Leo is most interested in steering this discussion.
It's going to be very interesting around synodality, because I think you're quite right. It's going to be a defining feature of the Leonine pontificate as well as the Franciscan one. But I'm unpersuaded yet that he's going to take it in the kind of direction Francis would have taken it. And the reason for that is Francis talked regularly, as you know, at the Synod, because you were a reporter there at the same time I was. He talked regularly about the inverted pyramid. And I'm not sure that the inverted pyramid is a symbol or an image that Leo will be comfortable with. I have a sense that he's much more comfortable with a hierarchical mode of operating. It doesn't mean that synodality won't have an important role to play in shaping his papacy, as you indicated earlier. But it does seem to me that it's going to run counter to his experience and his temperament. Whereas in a way, Francis was the consummate disruptor. He disrupted things and he moved on and went on. And there were problems with that. And certainly in a very real way, having Leo come in as a consolidator is an important feature of of his papacy already. And we're only still early days into it. But I'm not as sanguine about how synodality is going to evolve in the Leo papacy unless there are going to be critical figures in the general secretariat of the synod and his advisors, unless they take some initiative and help to shape his vision. Because I think we already have indications of this in some of the remarks he's made, as you already indicated, Chris, where he talks about it as an attitude, as a style. I think for Francis, it was more substantive than that.
Yeah, I think to that I would just add, you know, he part of him, I suspect, is of the opinion that the Curia is not synodal, and he sees that as a deep problem, and so he has to get them on board first. And in leaning into that, there is the fear, perhaps, that it becomes a more hierarchical understanding of synodality. So perhaps you are correct in sort of Francis's understanding of the inverted pyramid is not really what's at the top of mind for him. The other thing that I think will be a real test for him is who is his kitchen cabinet going to be? Is he going to have this college, this C9 sort of, of cardinal advisors? I would love a much more synodal approach would be for it not to just be, cardinals, but, perhaps heads of religious orders, laity. And that could be a real sign as to sort of how he's thinking about synodality and governance. But we just simply do not know, and we can only speculate at this point.
I want to transition to the polls in a minute, but I want to do so by using this question. You've talked about it, Dan's talked about it, and Charlie and Michelle as well. He is an American pope. He's the first American pope. He defines himself in many ways as a Latin American too. You're quite right. Of course, 50% of his ministry, I think, was spent in Peru. But as the first American pope, this is a twofold question. Number one, and you've commented in your own analysis and reportage in columns as well as in the book, the problems Francis had with the American hierarchy. Are they going to be repeated by Leo? Will Leo go to the United States? One remembers that Benedict did go to Germany, and of course John Paul II spent a good deal of time in Poland, but Francis never went to Argentina. What's your sense about how he's going to cope with the ecclesio-political reality on the shores of his own country, having to negotiate that or navigate that as an American pope?
Yeah, I think you'll see. Look, he's such a young pope that he'll have to visit the United States at a certain point, even if it's just to refuel the plane or something. Uh, but no, I think it's preposterous to think that he would not visit the United States. In fact, his brother said something in the interview about how he made him promise that he would attend his funeral, and presumably that would be in the United States. But I think you know Peru will be a priority over the United States just in terms of pastoral visits. We're going to see his first international travel, likely at the end of November when he goes to Nicaea, to Turkey to mark 1700 years since the Council of Nicaea, possibly to Lebanon on that trip. Then I think we're looking at a Latin America trip where he'll do, certainly Peru, but probably tack on a few other countries as well. And only after that do I think the United States is on the table for consideration. I have to imagine that he would love to visit the United States in a post-Trump era. I think there's just the realities, of all the complicating factors of the Holy See's relationships with the United States, even if it is a Republican administration, will be made easier if Trump himself is not in the equation. So I think it's if I'm advising him, that's what I would say. Just wait this out. One of the more interesting tells I thought in the interview, and it was a line that I didn't immediately pick up on, was when he talks about his understanding of the United States, him being in America, and his relationship with his brothers. And he said, "We know that one of his brothers is a real sort of a MAGA type." And he in the interview he refers to how he still maintains good relationships with his brothers, even if one is on the far end of the political spectrum. And it's almost as if he was distancing himself from that. It was a subtle way to make a very important point. And I think that was a very interesting tell in the interview that hasn't gotten very much attention.
Is he going to distance himself from Cardinal Dolan in his views?
Well, I mean, Dolan is a tricky character, of course. Dolan, in a sense, is yesterday's news because he's on his way out.
No.
I think the general understanding, he's turned 75. He's probably got, at most a year left here in New York. So I think the more interesting thing is not how he engages with Dolan, but who he chooses to succeed Dolan as the new Archbishop of New York. I think he has no relationship with Dolan. Dolan has said that the first time they had a conversation was at breakfast on the morning of May 8th, just hours before Leo became Pope that afternoon. So that also goes to show you just how little clout Dolan had in Rome in the Francis era. He was not someone that was especially known or utilized in Rome during the Francis pontificate. And that's for a number of reasons. But I think, Dolan's decision in 2015 to sign on to the letter, sort of questioning aspects of the Synod on the Family,
Right.
but effectively, killed any sort of ecclesial advancement he would be.
At in the least. Dan, do you want to step in here on this?
Uh, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, again, right now, Leo and the American hierarchy are in an interesting position because, of course, most of the bishops, right, um, were many of the bishops were appointed by Francis. There were still a number who were very anti-Francis in prominent sees, many of whom have been turning 75. So, in addition to Cardinal Dolan, I believe Archbishop Aquila in Denver just turned 75 also. So there are a number of important appointments coming up. Also, Archbishop Gomez in Los Angeles is on the
Yes.
cusp. Um, so there are a number of important appointments um, coming up, as well as a pretty significant USCCB election coming up that I think will itself be a referendum on both what the bishops think of the kind of beginnings of the second Trump administration, which is quite mixed as we've seen, but also in a sense of what they think reacting to the Pope Leo era is going to mean. And I think with Cardinal Dolan in particular, who has kind of thrust himself back into the news. Interestingly, back into the secular news with commentary about Charlie Kirk. But in the Catholic news, and this is classic of Cardinal Dolan, by dedicating a mural in St. Patrick's Cathedral related to immigration. Right. So it's an example of sort of the duality of the man in certain respects. But um, there's been a lot of pressure, and I don't think very substantiated, around, will his replacement come very quickly because of all this? Whereas I think, um, as Chris said, Cardinal Dolan is yesterday's news, and there are bigger factors in the U.S. church, particularly the influence of conservative money through things like the Napa Institute, but which also filters out into things like Word on Fire with Bishop Robert Barron, who is quite a bit younger than Cardinal Dolan, as well as things like the Hallow app, right, which are very tied into right-wing money, but which come across to most American Catholics as pretty like innocuous and not ideological.
Yeah, Michelle?
Well, I just wanted to piggyback a little bit because, Chris, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about um, what you think Leo's Americanness really, how it might influence or not work with the American bishops, especially that they're so polarized. And yet, Leo himself said in that interview that he thinks, he'll be, um, that his Americanness will, his being an American is actually going to work for him with the bishops. And so I just wanted to hear you sort of comment a little bit more about that. And I know in our poll, I think about 56% people said that they agreed that Leo should reflect American values. Now, what that means in terms of reflecting American values, I think we can talk about. And 64% of Roman Catholics agreed that Leo should reflect American values. So, in any case, I just wanted to hear more your thoughts about whether his Americanness would, in fact, have influence on, or how it might or might not work with bishops, especially as polarized, as Dan is actually pointing out that they are.
Yeah, I think it's tough, Michelle, because the relationship between the U.S. bishops during the Francis era was just so strange, and I think it will take us some time to really absorb just the oddities of that at many levels. But Leo got to the heart of the matter, I think, in his own interview when he said, "They can't dismiss me and say I don't understand the U.S. church." And that was often used as such a fig leaf when discussing, Francis and the U.S. church. Oh, well, he's only been to the United States once. He doesn't speak English. He just doesn't understand us. That is off the table. And it's true that he's lived his adult life outside of the United States. But as someone pointed out to me when I was giving some book talks out in Chicago, um, he knows how Chicago politics works, and it's all relational. And he may have lived his adult life outside of the United States, but he's got the relationship still. And I think that's true. And if you think back on what I would say the two biggest, at least for relevance of this conversation, the two biggest issues on his desk that involved the United States, it would have been the um, the situation in Tyler, Texas, with a rogue bishop who is a QAnon conspiracy theorist who really denied the legitimacy of Pope Francis. And he had to get into the muck of that situation and understand all of the dynamics there. The money that was propelling this bishop's sort of rise to power, the way social media sort of was an exponential factor in his reach. He had to understand all the complicating factors there. And quite frankly, it was under his watch that something was finally done. I mean, this was a case that just dragged on an inexcusable amount of time, in my view. And it was only once after he took office that something was finally done about the situation. So I think, that gave him some insight on just how divided the U.S. church is. And then I would say the February 2025 letter that Francis sent to the U.S. bishops, he was certainly involved in that. And I put in the book that it would have been inconceivable for him not to have been involved in it. And then he sort of, attests to the fact that he was involved in it in the interview, in which Francis, some people misread that letter as it was Francis giving a pat on the back of the U.S. bishop saying, "Oh, isn't it great all the work you're doing on behalf of immigrants?" And it was, no, it was far more substantive. And it was Francis saying, do more. You have to, collectively oppose mass deportations. And I think that's the line Leo will hold. Uh, will the fact that he is this more, uh, perhaps less confrontational personality be something that wins over more U.S. bishops? I think probably that's the case with some that are kind of in the middle, that perhaps weren't hostile to Francis, but certainly weren't enthusiastic about him. They'll see Leo as perhaps more of their flavor, their style, and I think that could help him there.
Let's bring Charlie in at this point. He's agreeing animatedly, nodding his head and whatnot. Charlie, what do you have
Well,
to say here?
I got a couple of things, Chris. So the first, I didn't get to mention this earlier, but to praise you for putting out such an excellent book in only 10 days is giving hope to me and my students that if they only get 10 days before a paper, they can do something fantastic, and they should look at your reporting to see what really good writing and work can do when you're prepared and ready. But I also want to think a little bit, because we know that Pope Leo's a White Sox fan. And I think there's a danger about us playing a little bit of inside baseball, which is we have this wonderful poll, which was a partnership between Sacred Heart University and Great Blue Research, where we had folks from our School of Communication, Media, and the Arts, as well as Dan and myself, formulating some questions that then went out to the whole country. And one of the things that I found most shocking is only 10.9% of respondents said they were very familiar with synodality. And if we want to make this even more dangerous for us, less than 30% of respondents had any familiarity in that top point. So I think the most important question we got to put on the table is there an elephant in the synodal hall, which is those of us who are professional in the Catholic world, whether in Catholic higher education or you in Catholic journalism? We're very excited about synodality and this vision for the church from Pope Francis now into Pope Leo. Is there a danger, not just that the church hierarchy doesn't understand American Catholics, but how are we going to call American Catholics to also understand a direction for the church in the third millennium? I'd love to hear your thoughts, Chris, of being someone who knows the global church, but also knows how important it is to communicate these ideas.
Yeah, and since we're pivoting to the poll, let me praise all of you for this poll. I was very excited when Dan first told me that this was in the works. It's if my book was one of the first out of the gate, this is the first poll out of the gate, and it's been instructive and helpful for me in this moment and in this past month. So thank you, and huge congratulations to all of you for commissioning it and pulling it off. And you're right that when I looked at the results, that was the first thing that jumped out at me as well. But also not entirely surprising, because we knew just that the U.S. had one of the lowest sort of percentages of participation in the global Synod process. Um, I do want to say, and this is not just sort of trying to have a glass half full perspective. Having traveled the globe a lot over the last few years with Pope Francis, and then attending various conferences and doing reporting trips, the story is not the same everywhere. And I think vividly back to a conversation I had with the Archbishop of Nairobi in July of 2022, who had just finished their consultation process, and they had 5 million people participate in Nairobi. And that's a pretty astonishing figure. And I was stunned by that. And so there, it's just, the fact that the U.S. is on the very low end of that is to our shame. And I think the real one of there are multiple reasons for this. One, I would have to say, is of course just the tepid response from the U.S. bishops. There was the U.S. and Canada, but I would point the U.S. being at fault. The North America was the only region that did not have an in-person continental gathering.
Correct.
And I think that was something that the Synod Secretariat tried to nudge the U.S. bishops into sort of doing this in person, and they were rather stubborn in that. So if there's not leadership at the top, then it sort of handicaps the whole process. It limits what is possible. But there is the concern that people look at synodality and seeing it as all being inside baseball and just a lot of navel gazing. So that will be the challenge for Leo, for the Synod Secretariat. How do you connect synodality with not just issues of matters of liturgy, but matters of peacemaking and issues at a global scale? And that's far beyond my pay grade.
Here, there is an interesting point, building on what Chris has just said, with which I agree, and that is that the synod, when you talk to or heard at the press conferences individual bishops or representatives from various ecclesial jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, but also in Ireland, the comment was made again and again: if we don't become a synodal church, we're dead in the water. A very strong belief that the Belgian church said, look, if we don't embrace synodality, there will be no church in Belgium. I don't think that sense of urgency exists in North America. We don't have a sense that somehow if we don't become synodal, we're going to disappear. And so synodality as an ecclesiological concept hasn't been properly integrated. And I think Chris is right. The failure of the North American church, by which I mean the United States and Canada, Mexico operated within the Latin American orbit, failed miserably to take the challenge on synodality at heart. And so it's going to be one of the challenges going forward, because that statistic of 10%, that is depressing. Is it just academics talking among ourselves about synodality and journalists in the way that we talked about collegiality after the Second Vatican Council, and it took us decades to implement it, right? To understand it. So there may be a long gestational period for this, but from the European point of view, they don't have time for this. The Germans, particularly, have said if we don't become a synodal church, we will disappear from the European map. And they're serious about this, right, Chris? I mean, they're not. This isn't hyperbole in the Trumpian manner. This is a serious realization that the church on the ground in Europe will die if it doesn't become synodal.
Yeah, and I think that perspective is certainly shared by the likes of Natalie Beccar, the number two at the Vatican Synod Office, Mario Grech, who runs the Synod Office. That's certainly a European perspective, but it is shared that it is the only way forward.
Well, let's move on now to the poll. And you're right. I didn't have any part, by the way, in planning, organizing, or orchestrating the poll. This was done by my colleagues, and it's wonderful to see the results, even if the results are rather startling. I'm going to go to this one. This will be my point of entry, and perhaps we can all talk about this. And that is already Michelle had alluded to it in an earlier comment, but it is among the younger respondents to this poll. They want to see the Pope comment on U.S. political issues such as immigration, climate change, or gun violence. And that percentage was quite high, almost 48%. Um, would that not be a significant departure from Vatican polity? I mean, we do know that John Paul II never hesitated to interfere in political life in Poland. Um, Francis kept his distance from the Kirchners in Argentina. There was a lot of strain there, so he kept his distance. And of course, with Benedict, among his antagonists, the German bishops were principal among them. So the world is different, however, for Leo. And how is he? Is it likely that he will comment on these issues? It would be a departure from Vatican neutrality diplomatically, but it would be a moral exhortatory thing, which is typical also of Vatican policy. How is he going to negotiate that? How is he going to comment on immigration and these other issues as an American pope to the American church?
Well, this is why people were rather turned off historically by electing a pope from what is arguably the world's leading superpower, even if it's on the decline. But it will seem as if he's faced uh, with weighing in on issues facing his homeland at every twist and turn. It was interesting after the shooting in Minnesota at the Catholic school there. Everyone wanted to know what he was going to say specifically about gun violence. And I thought, what we saw from him is perhaps an insight of how he will go about addressing some of these issues to sort of address it, but not not head on. He talked about the pandemic of arms, both large and small. And that was his way of speaking to the situation of U.S. gun violence, but also linking it to wars we're seeing around the world. So I think we'll try to see him do sort of a both and as much as possible. But it just seems inevitable as the Trump administration continues on this course that at some point he will be forced to say something quite specific, particularly on migration, or just frankly, as we see just our institutions sort of corrode, that he won't say something that perhaps will be seen as him setting off the alarm bells.
A friend of Sacred Heart over the years is Cardinal McElroy in Washington. Do you think he will become a major source or conduit of information and advice with how to deal with Washington?
Well, when I was ticking off the sort of two big issues that had been on Robert Prevost's desk involving the American Church, the third that came to mind was the appointment of Cardinal McElroy in Washington, D.C. And it certainly seems that part of the reason he was picked to lead the Archdiocese of Washington was to have a strong and steady voice there at a time when the U.S. Church and the country more broadly needs one. What is also true is that Cardinal Robert McElroy inherited an archdiocese that needed a lot of tending to for internal matters, and we've seen him dedicate much of his early months to that, particularly addressing the sort of bleak financial picture of the archdiocese and the continuing fallout from the clergy abuse scandals, particularly dating back to former Cardinal McCarrick. I think we'll have to see what Cardinal McElroy does in the coming weeks and months in terms of what he wants to say about what is happening, not just in his own backyard in the Capitol, but in the country more broadly. And if his track record, is something to be looked at, he hasn't been shy about naming things very directly and bluntly, and I think we can expect more of that. So I think he'll walk and chew gum at the same time. He'll continue to focus on the archdiocese while also sort of tending to a country that is very much ailing.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to weigh in?
Well, Chris, so one of the things I'm thinking about is, when we look at the poll, the big issue that most people want Pope Leo to think about is the sex abuse crisis. And, talking about the role of women, or I don't even know where the LGBTQ is. I mean, that's pretty low on the totem pole. So those are those other hot button issues, right? And even in his interview, he said a little bit about that. And I was just wondering what you think how he will proceed. Will he simply proceed with, a welcoming, open church? We welcome you, we embrace you, but not really move the needle much on LGBTQ or the issue of women, just as an example.
Yeah, I think when it comes to sort of LGBTQ issues, women, I want to separate women from LGBTQ issues because I think on LGBTQ issues, I think his inclination is to just allow for pastoral flexibility. I don't, I think fiducia supplicans, allowing for blessings, was perhaps the grandest gesture we're going to get in that regard. If there's anything further in that I could foresee at some point down in the immediate future, would be some sort of revision of the language of disordered in the catechism. That being something that is done at some point that I suspect he's probably open to. But I think his general approach is to say, yes, Father James Martin and others working in this space, you know, preach the message of todos, 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 and just kind of, let that be something that it operates, but without much oversight or, frankly, concern. I do think his concerns at the moment are peacemaking, poverty, migration. I think those are the issues that keep him up at night. I don't think he's really thinking much about a pastoral plan at a top level on LGBTQ concerns. On women, I think it's slightly different only because on women, there are questions that involve, ministries in the church, the diaconate, women in positions of power at the Vatican. And on those, I think he's going to have to take firmer decisions. He'll have to make a decision at some point as how he wants to proceed on the question of women deacons. I think we've been given every indication that he'll continue in putting women in positions of leadership at the Vatican. I think we know that he's trusted a number of women, folks like Emile Secuda, the secretary at the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, and others, and that he sees that as the right direction of travel.
Charlie.
So, Chris, I'm just curious. You've taken a look at this poll. You've had a chance to meet with Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo. What's the question you want to ask him now that you've seen some of these results and some of these thoughts? What do you want to know from the Holy Father?
Well, I'll say two things. I'm just struck by, in general, at how, whether it's John Paul, Benedict, Francis, now Leo, Americans tend to like their popes. I mean, popes have approval ratings that most politicians would kill for, and that is certainly holding true with Leo. And there's something to be said for the home field advantage, being when you're polling a U.S. audience. What was interesting to me is where he ranked on communication style. And I think we see general, high marks for his communication style, a little less than Francis in the poll. And Francis communicated so well through gesture. Francis was the great pope of speaking through action. And I witnessed this time and time again around the world. Leo actually has a much greater ability to communicate through words just because he's a polyglot. He's not leaning into that in the way that he should, in my view. I mean, I think if he made appeals for Gaza in English, they would reverberate around the world in ways that we're not seeing take off in Italian. And I guess it's not so much a question as perhaps a friendly criticism or corrective. But when are you going to take advantage of those, nice polyglot skills that you have and use this megaphone that you have and your ability to communicate to the world? I mean, it would do you a lot of good, and it would do the church a lot of good on a number of fronts. And also, what have you learned from Francis's communication style that you might want to emulate? I think we see from the interview, this man who is cautious and careful and wise, but could benefit from a bit more fire in the belly. So,
Okay, Dan, we'll have to wrap up in a few minutes, our program here because we're near our hour's end. Dan, you have any comments?
Sure. I'll kind of keep it in the spirit that we've been in here of throwing something to Chris. So, one of my readings of the poll was this sense of the American view of Leo, almost in a sense of like the nation turning its lonely eyes to him, right? Of the sense of like his emerging as a figure that Americans admire, in part because, right, they're sort of having a hard time finding figures to admire, right, on a broad level like this, right? So, and particularly in the political sphere, right, there are other figures like maybe Taylor Swift or somebody, right, who might figure into that. But so, and again, it's very interesting given his temperament, as we've described in all this, is sort of a soft spoken. Do you think he has a sense? I mean, he hasn't. Well, he hasn't read. Well, we don't know that he hasn't read the poll. Actually, we never know what gets in his inbox. But do we think he has a sense or that that is how he's viewed, because there is this, um, beyond people like his brother, right, who have great enthusiasm, there is a sense of like, where is leadership? Do you think he feels that pressure or that longing for leadership from here?
So the main takeaway I have from Dan, if I heard you correctly, is that we need a Leo Taylor Swift mashup. Is that correct?
If he officiated the wedding, that would be
It'd be a
that would
great
be a big
PR
event.
too. No, I think this is a man. I know this is a man who reads widely, and I don't think there's any reason that has changed since becoming pope. And when I mean reads widely, I don't just mean theology. I mean I think he is a bit of a media junkie. And I think those habits perhaps have been curtailed a bit by becoming pope, but I think he's paying quite close attention to how he's perceived, and I've been told as much by those close to him that he's still reading the papers, and I think that's good.
That's very good. Okay, I'm just going to wrap it up now to thank you, Chris, for bringing your animated professional expertise to the dynamic here. It's added considerably to our sharing our views today on the Cor Ecclesiae, and we'll be back. We'll be back at the end of the month with a new hour, looking at some other aspect and some other dimension, and we'll be having other guests during the course of the year. But let's conclude with this one. Chris, do you have another book on the horizon?
Oh, I need to finish getting this one out of the system first. It's certainly not another book on Leo in the foreseeable future. We need a few years to let him begin to make his mark before we get a better sense of what he's up to. So I'll let this one sort of work its way out into the world first. So
Well, however long its gestation, we look forward to it. I'm sure we'll have you back when it comes out.
this was a real delight. Thank you all so much for your generous engagement of my work and for this poll, which has helped really the U.S. Church more broadly. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank our visitors, our
Thank
guests,
you, Chris.
and our subscribers.